I'm so excited about what will be coming forward soon. Again, thank you for that background, Dr. Ray, of mentioning that the Theological and Ethical Perspectives on AIDS and Violence class was one that Dr. Terrell teaches and will probably continue to teach, that discusses the theological and ethical categories of the church, synagogue, mosque, and how they respond to HIV, AIDS, and persons with HIV, AIDS, and the pervasiveness of violence in our culture and our world. And kind of coming in midway with this, I realized that Dr. Terrell is a force. I mean, I knew that, but a part of what she does with this class is produce a play at the end. And so I realized, I'm gonna let Dr. Terrell have that because that is a gift. And so I realized that we're gonna have to just switch and be flexible. So thankfully I talked to the persons in the class, and we were able to kind of just co-create something different, something that felt necessary to Nic, who's in the class. And so we're really excited to be able to present something that kind of came from the co-creation, which is the Passion, Sex, and Seminary podcast. So it's going to be a very podcast-like experience. We've pre-recorded a session that you will see after Nic does some amazing things in a minute, but you will see a recording between Nic and Donald. And I just want you to know that this is an abbreviated conversation from, it's about an hour-long conversation, because the hope is that Nic will launch a full podcast in 2021. And so hopefully that larger conversation will be there, but this is an abbreviated about 30-minute conversation that you're gonna see today. And I just want you to know that it's a bit more of a Christian focus for this particular one, but just remember that these are folks that are sharing their stories, their experiences, and their understanding to help and create a more just and equitable world. So when you're seeing this, when you're hearing what comes next, I want you to please handle yourself as well as those that you're going to be hearing and seeing with care, and realize that these are real lives. These are real stories. And yeah, there's a bit of a performative piece that, with doing this podcast, but know that there are real lives behind this that matter, and that they really are pushing for more justice and equity, and realizing that violence is very real in this world. So please just be receptive to that and open to that. And I'm just honored to have been on this journey, and I'm grateful to Nic to be open to co-create with you for this class. Nic, I'm grateful to have had you as a student and for what you and Donald have produced. I think it's amazing. So with that, I am going to leave. Well, not leave out here, but I will leave this part, and everything else is going to be turned over to Nic, who is they, them, theirs, who is a queer activist, writer, and aspiring academic based in Chicago. They are studying for a Master's of Divinity with a concentration in LGBTQ studies. Their interests include gender studies, purity culture, fundamentalism, sexuality, justice, religion, and theology. So with no further ado, take it away, Nic.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lockhart, and the pleasure is also mine. So to begin with, before we go into the clip, we got to talk about the definition of HIV and AIDS. What I have here from the CDC is, and I'm reading this directly, HIV is human immunodeficiency virus. Pardon me, apparently I cannot speak correctly today. Is a virus that attacks the body's immune system. If it's not treated, it can lead to AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. There is currently no cure for HIV. However, with proper medical care, it can be controlled, as we'll talk about a little bit more in the podcast. And AIDS is the most severe stage of HIV, which is stage 3. People with AIDS have badly damaged immune systems, and they can get increasing number of severe illnesses called opportunistic infections. People receive an AIDS diagnosis when they develop OIs, or their CD cell 4 counts, which is their blood cells. I think it's red blood cell, if I'm correct, drops below 200 cells per milliliter of blood. And it's very important that we talk about the history of HIV and AIDS. So its history actually comes from European colonialism in Africa. So in the 20s, when European colonialists wanted more resources to take back home, they would venture into jungles, which the indigenous Africans knew not to go into. So then what happened is they would get HIV, which, from a trans-species contamination from monkeys, which they had SIV. So then within this time, the men wanted, companionship. So they would turn to prostitutes and they would turn to sex work, which through that which helped spread HIV, which then we go into the American context within the 70s and 80s, how it traveled into Haiti to where gay and straight men would go into places like Haiti to go on sex tourism. And then they would bring it back to the US, which is how we have HIV as it is. So also before I go into the clip, it's very important that I introduce my friend Donald, one of my favorite people on earth. He is a sex educator. He does work with writing. He is a graphic designer. He started a business called Queerly Beloved. I mean, this guy has done like everything. And he wrote an article back in 2017 coming out as gay and also talking about having HIV and being Christian. What you will see in this conversation, as Dr. Lockhart mentioned, is very vulnerable, very amazing. And honestly, it was, oh my God, it was an amazing conversation, y'all. I've been excited for y'all to see this. Now, without further ado, I think it's time we watch it. This is Nic with Passion, Sex, and Seminary, and today's guest is Donald Scherschlitt.
Hi.
So today we're going to be talking about HIV and AIDS and the stigma around it, particularly of how it affects in religious spaces. I have a couple questions for you, Donald.
Yeah, sure.
One of the first ones being, what stigma did you notice after you were diagnosed?
I told my parents when I found out that I was HIV positive. So I found out I was HIV positive in May of 2017. And so I called my parents, who I'm very close with. They're not like necessarily the most supportive folks, but they care about me. And so I called them and was like, hey, I need to tell you something about my health. And my dad said, and I said, I'm HIV positive, basically. And my dad goes, oh, well, how many guys did you have to fuck to get that one? And, I had prepared myself for a lot worse from my dad. So I honestly found it kind of funny. But, I do think about that a lot. I kind of had to fumble and be like, that's not like your business. And it only takes one person. And so, yeah. And then my mom had a similar issue reaction, less crass, but she said, she said like, I always knew this was possible because you were gay. And that was true, although gay men are not necessarily, the way we calculate risk of HIV, it's not like just a gay disease, and that's a huge misconception. Yeah. But again, it's the stigma that I have received has often been from people who are homophobic already. I've gone the like AIDS is God's punishment for being gay speech before. And that's fine. But I guess what I'm saying is like a lot of the stigma I received has been rough, but probably not as rough as it could be because I'm also a white man, white cisgender man. And so and HIV is not like a visible thing. So I go around in the world a lot. I'm luckily very insured and have very good health insurance. So I will say for me, the stigma has not been as bad as it could be. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Since so many times when we talk about it affecting gay men, I think we forget about the conversation of how it affects people of color, particularly trans women of color. We forget about the conversations of how it affects sex workers, if I'm correct. And I think it opens up more conversations of we talk about HIV in a way where it's linked to morality.
And I think that comes from, sex being linked to morality.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea that, if you are married and monogamous and, you've never had sex with anyone but your spouse, then, and you're straight, and so, I don't know, all of that, then there's this idea that you won't get HIV because which, like, theoretically, I guess your odds are very low, but the idea people tell themselves then is they link that to, like, it's because I'm a good person, essentially. And that's not the case. A lot of good everyday people get HIV. And so I will say going back to the stigma conversation, a lot of the stigma that I had first came from just myself. I was very lucky to have friends and some family and a boyfriend who were all supportive. But for me, I had to, like, as someone who educated a lot of my friends on STDs and on reducing shame and stigma, I was surprised by how much of that stigma I felt still, how much shame and embarrassment I felt around my diagnosis. Because again, like my dad said, there's a thing of, like, how many guys did I have to fuck to get that one? And while it only takes one,
exactly,
it did have me thinking, like, oh, am I, like, too am I doing things that should I have known better, essentially? And yeah, so there's a lot of that I had to work through.
Yeah. And I bet it must have been, like, it's good that you had a support system too.
Yeah.
Because I know for so many, they may not have the support system, they may not have the money, they may not have the ability to get to a doctor.
I mean, the fact of the matter is we often see HIV as a gay disease, but we often see gay people as white. And so it ignores the large fact that, or the large amount of people of color, especially Black people in the South, especially, who are disproportionately impacted by HIV, actually. And not just gay Black people, but Black people who are cisgender, who are straight. A lot of Black women are HIV positive, and it's due to not just discrimination in even getting health insurance, but discrimination then in healthcare, in the fact that people of color are often denied their basic needs when they do finally get to the doctor,
Exactly. Since I think it's, because when talking about HIV and AIDS, it's very important that we talk about it in a way that's intersectional. That, because we read it as a gay white cis man's disease, but in reality, HIV is still anyone can get it. It doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is. It doesn't matter what your gender identity is. It doesn't matter, where you're from. I think we talk about it in a way that not only erases people of color, particularly, as you said, Black women in the South, that erases trans women.
I was thinking through more stigma I've faced, and I would say another one is when if I were to go out and, like, hook up with someone, I would not. Sometimes it depends on the person. Sometimes I'll disclose my status. Sometimes I won't. Now, the fact is, I'm undetectable. I take my medication regularly. That means I can't transmit my disease to anyone. And sometimes I just want to fuck. And so
exactly. Yes.
Again, HIV is not a visible. So I can pass like that. But I do have, like, a low key sometimes in those situations, especially if I were to hook up with someone. That's actually a big one, where I fear for my safety around if I were to disclose that I was HIV positive and they had a dangerous reaction. Think about that specifically because I think of trans women who may not be disclosing that they're trans because they have to worry about their safety. And not obviously not one-to-one, but again, all of this is just so connected. Can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
if you were to go hook up with someone, do you disclose your gender identity, or?
I'm usually cautious when I do, because like on my Grinder and Scruff, there's I think no pictures of me being femme on there, and maybe my Tinder and Bumble, maybe one or two.
Yeah.
And it's tough because I know if I were, if they were to see me showing up in my 3-inch heels, I could be dead on the street. As much as I love my heels.
Yeah. No, I mean, we just had Trans Day of Remembrance last week.
Yeah.
And it always gets me. How long it means.
Kind of for me, when it comes to a gender identity, in my case, which I don't want to compare it.
But I am curious.
Yeah. I usually make an out plan.
Say that again.
I usually make an out plan. So if I have to get out.
Okay.
Yeah, to where like my phone's always with me somewhere.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, it's like people just cannot, not get violent and not try to understand and educate themselves.
Yeah. Do you have a, because this is something I'm dealing with today still, is like, how do you make the decision of if you ever decide that you're going to disclose your gender to someone, and how do you come to that decision?
For me, I mean, it's usually on my Grinder thing, but no one really reads it.
Yeah.
So it's where I usually gauge the conversation for a bit, because I don't do it in person. I disclose it before I meet to see how they'll react.
Okay.
In the chat. And then for me, and how that reaction goes, it's either, I think I've only had one person get rude with me.
That's good.
Like, I think the others maybe, I'm trying to think, it's either been cool and it gets ignored, or it's cool, thank you for telling me. But I recognize that it does get, like on Grindr and Scruff, I don't have pictures of me being femme on there.
Right.
Just because, like, I get questions of, will you quote unquote cross dress for me? I'm like, that's very inappropriate to ask. No, I don't dress like this for men. So I was thinking about some of the stereotypes. As we mentioned earlier, we talk about it only being white cisgender gay men. How do we dispel that stereotype?
I mean, so I am not the first, I will not be the last to say this. There's been a truism of HIV since the beginning, which is that this disease does kill people, yes, but so do fear and ignorance. Those are the two, and I would add apathy. Those are I would add apathy to that. Fear, ignorance, and apathy. I mean, ACT UP famously said silence equals death, and that's very
true.
So I was thinking about how I would have felt in May when I found out that I was HIV positive if I did not have a boyfriend, if my sister was not visiting me that week, if I did not have friends I could talk to, if I did not have a really great employer who gave me off to kind of just chill. And so I was just thinking about that a lot because it would have been really shitty and sucky. And I don't know if I would have been doing as well as I have been if even like one of those things hadn't been in place, like my boyfriend, my family, my friends, my job. And so at that point, I guess it felt necessary for me to come out as HIV positive, because I very much fit the image of the good gay man. I very much was. I was dating someone. I am a white man. I am very good at. I am not too femme. I am not too like queer for people. I kind of pass as straight sometimes. I don't try to, but I can. I don't want to either, but I can. And so for me to be HIV positive kind of broke that image. And so since then, I've had people who have reached out to me because they were diagnosed with HIV,
Mhm.
and I can walk them through what to do. I keep in touch with 3 or 4 people right now who I've kept in touch with for at least a year for most of them, just to talk through um, how we're doing as HIV positive people, as people living with HIV. Yeah, because that's just important. And so I think education, if we're talking about breaking these stigmas, breaking these stereotypes, education, telling people about your status if you feel like you can safely do so, um, breaking the image of uh, who is someone living with HIV in this country and around the world. Um, and, and, uh, and yeah, I think that's it. I did not know a lot. I mean, I thought I knew a lot about HIV before I got diagnosed. I did not know shit. I learned. I knew like what it was, but I did not know anything about the history of it, the
Mhm.
way in which it's a product of colonization, the ways in
Yeah.
which uh, it disproportionately affects people of color and trans
Mhm.
people, as we've said uh, multiple times now.
Yeah.
I didn't know any of that, and so I think I can't blame people if they don't know that. Like I didn't know
Mhm.
that until I had a motive to learn, which was that I was positive. But now I want
Exactly.
other people to learn.
Yeah, because I was thinking about how, especially in the way we teach sex ed in this country, a good example of in Indiana back in 2014, under then Governor Mike Pence, we had a huge HIV outbreak.
Yeah,
And that was, because he cut funding toward, sexual education and HIV and AIDS funds. I think about how much, as you said, like education is extremely important. What would that look like in a religious setting?
about back to a workshop I did a couple years ago at
Mhm.
the Christian Fellowship Conference
Mhm.
on HIV and faith.
Yeah.
And we started by I had printed out. I still have them in a desk
Yeah.
in the other room. Uh, well over 100 photos of people who had died of HIV.
Mhm.
People who were just, some of them were famous celebrities, some of them were artists, some of them were just average people living their lives. But my goal was, when going through and kind of selecting these people, to pick a variety of genders, a variety of sexual orientations, a variety of race and class, ethnicities, ability, all these different, to show that HIV affects all these people.
Mhm.
And what we did at the start of the workshop um, I wrote their names and some details down about their life on the back of the
Mhm.
photo, and their date of birth and the date they died from AIDS, um, and and specifically like how they died. Um, and we just started out by taking like 10 minutes, and whatever photo was at your seat, I had a photo in each seat. We just sat and like read their names out loud, and basically for me, I think I've said this for I've said this before I had HIV, but I really feel connected to my queer ancestors.
Yeah.
Take that very seriously, very deeply. I feel the spirits of queer people around me.
I get
That's not
that.
really true, but it's how I see the world, and that
Yeah.
I only had a greater sense of that after being diagnosed, just because of the sheer magnitude of this disease on queer people's lives.
Oh yeah.
Um, and so I, yeah, so I had to say those names as a way of like calling those ancestors back to life, of summoning their presence, of asking for their guidance and protection as we entered into that workshop space.
Exactly.
Because, and that's not education, obviously, that's not like
Mhm.
learning things, but I think something else that's very important about breaking these stereotypes is remembering the names of the people who died from AIDS,
Exactly.
still dying, and are still imprisoned and are still discriminated against. and saying their names and keeping their presence present, I guess.
Yeah. Keeping them alive in our hearts.
Yeah.
Because I think of people who thrive, like Jonathan Van Ness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is a good example. But I also think of people like he was in Queen.
Freddie Mercury.
Yeah. I want to make sure I remembered his name correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also important that we remember that's not just famous people, not just celebrities, but we also remember the everyday person. What would you say that religious settings do well within HIV and AIDS work?
So I think there's a lot that churches could improve upon, especially.
Agreed.
Obviously, and we're gonna just remove like conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical churches from this equation. We're gonna talk about the queer affirming churches, the churches that are pursuing racial justice, churches that are, in line with yours and my thinking. We're gonna those. I think there's a lot that could be improved upon. But the big thing is, I think, stigma. Again, when I came out, I wrote about my experience with HIV, specifically comparing it to Jesus and the lepers.
Yeah.
I wrote about that in the coming out post, specifically because I wanted to put my experience in religious terms, because I understood it in religious terms, but also so that other people, as a messaging opportunity almost, so that people would know that I was seeing it in religious terms, to know that this is a religious issue. I think the church is the most powerful force for change in the world today. I think it has to. I think that's fundamental to my beliefs. That's why I'm in seminary. I wouldn't be in seminary if that this church could change things in the world and make this world better for all of us. That said, I think a lot. I've never heard a sermon where someone talks about HIV. I've never heard I've never heard anyone say it during like our prayer requests in service. Talk about it. I mean, I've talked about it, but no one else does. And to be fair, maybe that's in my church that I've attended. Maybe that's because truly no one is affected by HIV there, which probably speaks to some of the privilege at the churches that I've attended. But I think we can't just like do a sermon on World AIDS Day and call it good for the year. This disease is continuing to kill people today in America, not just in some poor country in Africa. It is killing people today. It is causing people harm here today. And frankly, if we believe that we are, this is a very basic fact for me, but if we truly believe that like we are the body of Christ, then and I have AIDS or HIV in my blood, like I have that virus in my blood, then we are all responsible and dependent upon one another. We're dependent on one another, and that means that I would say like the body of Christ has AIDS. That's again I'm not the first person to say that, but that's how I would see it, is that this is a issue that the church needs to speak up on, specifically because it affects our members. And not just that, it affects our world. And it's not just about, even if we weren't in churches, HIV positive people would be deserving of care. Queer people are my chosen family, then the church is my unchosen family, because the people who are in the church are not necessarily people I want to be around.
I get that.
But I am called to be there for them anyway. And so, like, once again, it goes back to this whole idea of like, it's not just about whether or not I like you and therefore I will care for you and take your issue seriously, or whether or not you believe the same things I believe or you look like me. This is all part of breaking that stigma. It's
Exactly.
because you are a person and because I see you are a creation of God, which is how I see you, then I see fundamentally that I am part of you, that you are part of me.
Exactly. And that we're all a part of each other.
Yeah.
It's like a tree. We're all interconnected.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus has us drink his blood and his.
Exactly.
And if we're drinking Jesus's blood, we could get into the whole like sexual Jesus language, but like if we're drinking Jesus' blood, then theoretically, like that's a very in the way that we know about how HIV spreads, which is through blood or semen, like that's a very loaded image. So it's really, yeah. So again, I mean, HIV to me is such a fundamental issue in our society because it touches on everything. It's kind of like, oh, you want to talk about prison reform? You want to talk about safe needle exchange? You want to talk about harm reduction? You want to talk about safe?
Exactly.
You want to talk about funding Planned Parenthood? You want to talk about racial injustice in healthcare? You want to talk about anything, like anything. You want to talk about poverty in general? Like HIV touches on it. HIV is like this connective issue, which for me, I mean, I'm sure we can find connections in other ways, but for me, HIV touches every single issue in some way.
Oh, I would 100% agree.
Society. It is so much of the problems that we are dealing with impact specifically people with HIV, living with HIV differently and more than people without HIV. And the people who live with HIV are indicative of so many other injustices and are facing so many other injustices that the rest of our society faces, like the non-HIV positive people face.
Yeah, so many ways. I think we forget so often that HIV is more complex than how we talk about it.
Yeah. And I'm just particularly grateful for, I know you, Brett, mentioned Pose before we start recording, for just different media that, the ways showing HIV positive people on screen, and just showing, I think, the many complexities of living with this disease and how it affects.
Exactly.
Pose does a great job of it. I saw a play on Broadway called The Inheritance that is truly incredible. And it speaks to kind of what we've inherited from the generation of gay men who died of AIDS in the 90s. And that really broke me. I think of Angels in America is a classic.
That's the one I was thinking of.
It's, a classic for a reason. The Normal Heart, anything Larry Kramer did, opens up the narrative to say, I look like HIV. Like HIV looks like me. And this is really key because this poor, very promiscuous person who is sharing, a hypothetical person who is bad in our society.
Yeah.
Because they are what HIV looks like and I am what HIV looks like, then you have to ask the question of, well, why am, in many cases, people who look like me living and thriving with HIV, and people who are Black and brown often, face further struggles. And how, if I love this Donald, if you love me and I'm HIV positive and you love me with all my HIV, then you also have to love that person too. And if you don't, what's the difference? What is the difference between us? The difference is what? That they are not cisgender, that they are not white, that they are not a man, that they are not gainfully employed, that they are not, that they are addicted to drugs, that they are or struggling with substance use. What's the difference? You can start to parse that out really quickly, and that's the key thing. Like once you start to say, oh, well, I'm what HIV looks like, and so is that person, then you have to say, okay, well, we have to treat them the same. And if we don't, the answer is very clearly often due to racism or sexism or homophobia or as some other sort of injustice or bigotry.
Exactly. What resources would you recommend for preventing HIV? What would you recommend for, resources for people with HIV?
I would say if there is one thing that people can do if they're concerned about, getting HIV or getting tested, it is, well, there's a few things. And I will say, if you have insurance, talk to your doctor about getting on PrEP.
Oh yeah.
Truvada right away.
And there's also another one out called Disclose.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so talk to your doctor about getting on some sort of PrEP to help prevent the spread and protect yourself. I wish I had done that, but oh well. If you do not have health insurance, talk to your local AIDS service organization. You can look these up. They're all over the country. You can just look up the name of your city, AIDS service organization. It'll come up. You can also contact groups like Planned Parenthood I've talked to before for HIV care, and they're always so helpful and very good at working in a way that is not going to be stigmatizing and fearful, but is going to be helpful. So if you're trying to prevent the spread of HIV, those would be my three big healthcare tips. We often say use condoms as a cop-out for not having communications about our sexual health, and we or use protection of any kind as a cop-out for not having conversations about our sexual health with our sexual partners. And those should not be scary conversations. Those should be honest and vulnerable, but friendly conversations about our health, our concerns. It's part of consent.
And I think we also have PEP, right?
If you think you have an exposure to HIV, you can get PEP, but not PrEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis. And that will, within 72 hours, I think it is, you can go to a doctor's office, get it, you go to emergency room or urgent care, get PEP, and it can block the virus from spreading in your body. But if you are thinking that's the case, you need to do that. I always say ASAP, like now, like no waiting. It works best within, I think, the first 24 hours and decreases pretty rapidly in effectiveness after that. So you want to not delay.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I got to talk to you.
Oh my God, same.
Nic, if you don't mind, I want to say something before you jump in. First, I just want us to just take a deep breath and breathe in what we just witnessed. Just take a deep breath and breathe it in. What was shared was vulnerable, and I know maybe for some it felt awkward watching a conversation. There wasn't a lot of frills, there wasn't a lot of, but we wanted you to see this. So that we could, realize that these are conversations that need to happen. These are conversations that need to be normalized. These are conversations that are powerful and moving. And it's something about making space to listen, making space to see people and let them take up your whole screen today, because that is beautiful and wonderful. And so what that means to think about that. So I, again, just want to say thank you, Nic, and thank you, Donald, for your vulnerability, for your bravery, for having this conversation. And I hope that you all heard some things that maybe moved you to make some changes, to add, implement a little bit more, to do some things. I'm seeing a lot of things happening in the chat and what that means around labels and things of that nature. But they said it all, but I just really wanted us to know that we wanted you to hear a conversation. We want to normalize this conversation and let them be seen. Let people that, are experiencing these things in their lives take up space. So Yeah, I just wanted to say that before you jumped in, Nick, and I just wanted to give you a minute to breathe because I know rewatching this for you might have also, have you feeling ways as well. So thank you. And thank you for letting us witness that.
Thank you all so much for listening. And thank you, Dr. Lockhart, for your help with this. All right. So if you want to connect with Donald, you can connect with him on Twitter and Instagram at Donnie Sherlegit. I'm going to put that in the chat real fast. Oops. Here we go. One more time. Here we go. All right. And also, if y'all need, I do have a lot of resources. As we mentioned, Planned Parenthood is a really, really good resource. Like I've had really good experiences with Planned Parenthood. There's also, if you're in Chicago, there's Howard Brown Medical Center, where they're all over Chicago, where they provide HIV and STD testing. One thing I want to stress is that it is important to get tested every 3 months. Some other resources include, as we mentioned, Pose, a couple thrift shops in Chicago. We have Howard Brown, we have the Brown Elephant, which is owned by Howard Brown, which the proceeds go to their HIV research, and Out of the Closet Thrift Shop, which provides free HIV testing. And another thing I'd like to do is to be able to have a moment of silence for those who've been impacted. I have a few names right here. I have Freddie Mercury from Queen. Wow, this is emotional. Tom Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival, Eazy-E, Arthur Ashe. I have Anthony Perkins from who is Norman Bates in Psycho. And if you all want to put any names in the chat, you're allowed to. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Amen.
Thank you. And we'll turn it back over to Lisa.
Thank you, Dr. Lockhart. Thank you, Nic. Thank you for the conversation, for making space for this, as you said, Dr. Lockhart, for letting it take up our whole screen, our whole hearts for this moment. We have just a couple of announcements, and I think President Ray is going to lead us in our time of announcements. And so I'll wait for him to magically reappear in his screen.
I'm sorry, I forgot I had closed my camera off there. So Dr. Lockhart, Nic, thank you so much for wonderful time and engagement. One of the things that I actually surprisingly found myself feeling in this was a bit of joy. And the reason why is because when I began ministry back in the mid-'80s, in a community in which AIDS was beginning to ravage our community, the idea of living with HIV or living with AIDS was unimaginable to us. And so to actually be at a point in history where we have come to the point that not only are people able to live, but people are able to thrive as well. So on AIDS Remembrance Day, I want to remember all of those who've been lost, but then also I want us to remember and rejoice that all of those that we are not losing, all of those that we still have with us. In Hartford, where I began ministry and practiced ministry for the first decade, in the main cemetery in Hartford, you could see the AIDS epidemic because you could literally see just rows and rows and rows of people in their 20s. And usually they were small stones because they were poor people. But to think that we have, and to have lived through the time that we can now celebrate and rejoice that people are still with us. So while we want to remember all of those that we've lost, and we did lose so many over the years, the fact that we have friends, that we have family, that we have loved ones, that we can still hold dear and that we can still hold closely as a moment of celebration. So I want to, one, encourage each and every one of you to sit with what we've had the blessing to experience today, and also to recognize it's a blessing that you have the opportunity in your lives to be able to ensure that one, research continues, but I think even more importantly, that the spaces of care and hope grow so that those who do become infected with HIV and when it develops into AIDS, people will know that they have a circle of care and a family that will hold them through the journey. So I encourage you to do all of that. We have two announcements today. The first, I'm going to turn to Lisa Notter for an announcement from the Advancement Department.
Thank you, President Ray, and thanks to everyone for bringing this space to all of us today. I want to remind everybody that yesterday was Giving Tuesday. You can consider today Giving Wednesday. It kicked off our end of calendar year fundraising campaign. We have a solicitation that went to alumni and friends in the mail, and one going out to trustees. If you received one, it looks like this. It features our 3 new faculty members, and I want to thank Dr. Lockhart, Dr. Saeed, and Dr. Morales-Torres for giving us some wonderful quotes to use and being featured in this. And it also contains a little insert that tells you a little bit about the CARES Act and the fact that 2020, calendar year 2020, presents a great opportunity for philanthropy, a one-time only opportunity for people who do not itemize to still make a $300, get a $300 tax credit or up to a $600 tax credit if you're a married couple for philanthropic gifts. So I ask everyone to please consider CTS and your end of year giving plans. And I'll post a link to our online giving in the chat. It's always ctschicago.edu/give. So if anyone would like to make a gift, you can always go there. And for people who do itemize, they're allowed to deduct even more this year, up to 100% of your income. So there's a couple of different ways with the CARES Act that you can get credit for your philanthropic giving in ways that you usually cannot this year, only in calendar year 2020. So please consider making a gift and support all the great education and programming that CTS provides, and support our students with scholarship gifts, with giving whatever we can. We know all of you in the community give your time and your talent. We'd also like you to consider supporting us financially this year. And that's all I have. Who should I turn it back over to?
We're going to turn it over to Dean Stephanie Crowder for an announcement.
Good afternoon. I want to say to Nick and Dr. Lockhart, I was having flashbacks. I told our PhD professional development class that my first gig after graduation was not in the academy, but my first job with a newly minted PhD from Vanderbilt was serving as program director for a faith-based HIV/AIDS program that was funded by the CDC. It was in that religious community where I learned about World AIDS Day and National Testing Day in June. It was in that community, a faith community, a religious community, where I learned the ABCs: A for abstinence, B for being aware or knowing your status, and C for condoms. And so I'm sitting here just kind of relishing and taking joy in those moments, and realizing that it was in a religious community where I first learned about HIV/AIDS. On top of that, I was in seminary when the news came out about Magic Johnson. So thank all of you for this opportunity, and that yes, there are congregations that have been doing the work and that still are doing the work. But here's the reason I was given the mic. So on December the 15th, Tuesday, December the 15th, our newly minted full professor, Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva, we will celebrate her latest book, Dangerous Religious Ideas: The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Lisa Zook has a hot copy of it. It's hot red, and there it is. I would recommend that you go and get a copy of Dr. Mikva's book. On December 15th at 6:30. It's a Zoom session. I believe the link is in the chat already. Dr. Mikva will be in conversation with PhD student Rebecca Blackburn. So you are invited, you are encouraged to attend and to bring some people with you. Dr. Lockhart has her copy. I've been put to shame. I don't have my copy yet, but I want you to come. Please attend the book panel, the session, as we celebrate Dr. Mikva and her latest work. We are so excited. December 15th, which is Tuesday, 6:30 Central Time. There's a link in the chat. Please register and go out and get your book. And I'm going to do the same. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before we leave, I'm just going to put in a shameless plug, and I have to ask for your forgiveness for this. But if you, my first book, which was Do No Harm, that was published back in 2001, was one of the first. It was one of, I'll say early, because there were about 2 or 3 around the same time that took AIDS HIV/AIDS very seriously and made it a center of the work that was in a theological text. So if any of you want to have, because, and the only reason why I bring that up is because besides a shameless plug, really what we were thinking about at that time before the cocktail, and what we were thinking about and how we were trying to grapple with it. But again, that was my first book back in 2001. That was one of the very early texts in that regard. Okay, y'all. Thank you so much. Nic, once again, we want to thank you for bringing us a very, very, it wasn't simply thoughtful, but it was an immersive opportunity. So we want to thank you for that conversation and thank you for bringing it to us, because we want you to know we receive it as a gift. And also, Dr. Lockhart, we want to thank you as well for agreeing to continue the work in that class, which made this possible. So thanks to both of you, and we will see you next week when we have our Wednesday reflection at noon. Thank you. Take care.